On May 8, 1945, when victory bells rang across Europe and champagne corks popped in celebration of Nazi Germany's defeat, something peculiar was already happening in the shadows of that triumph. While American soldiers stood exhausted in the rubble of Berlin and along the banks of the Elbe River, the story of how they got there was already being rewritten. The maps were being redrawn, the credit was being redistributed, and some of the most extraordinary American achievements of the war were quietly being filed under someone else's name. What you're about to hear isn't just a forgotten chapter of history. It's a systematic erasure of American ingenuity, sacrifice, and strategic brilliance that changed the outcome of the Second World War. If you appreciate deep dives into the untold stories of history and want to see more content that challenges the conventional narrative, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't regret it. Let me take you back to a cold morning in November 1942, to a beach in North Africa that most people have never heard of. While the world's attention was focused on the brutal Eastern Front and the RAF's bombing campaigns over Germany, American forces were about to execute one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history, an operation so complex and unprecedented that it would become the blueprint for every major Allied landing for the rest of the war. Operation Torch involved landing over 100,000 troops across 2,000 miles of hostile coastline, coordinating naval forces across 2 oceans, and establishing a foothold in enemy territory with virtually no combat experience. The Americans pulled it off with a level of logistical sophistication that left even Churchill speechless, though he'd never publicly admit it. But here's what happened next. Within months of Torch's success, British military historians were already describing it as a joint operation, emphasizing Montgomery's subsequent campaigns in Tunisia, while glossing over the fact that American forces had secured the beachheads, established the supply lines, and created the conditions that made those campaigns possible. The narrative shifted from American innovation to Allied cooperation, which sounds noble until you realize that specific American achievements were being systematically downplayed. General Patton's brilliant tank maneuvers at El Ghoutar, the first major American victory against German forces, somehow became a footnote in the larger story of British desert warfare. The pattern was set, and it would repeat throughout the war with increasingly brazen revisionism. Consider the intelligence war, the secret battle fought in the shadows that may have shortened the conflict by years. Everyone knows about Bletchley Park and the brilliant British codebreakers who cracked the Enigma machine. It's been the subject of books, films, documentaries, an endless celebration of British intellectual superiority. Alan Turing has rightly been recognized as a genius whose work saved countless lives. But what almost nobody talks about is the American contribution to signals intelligence that was, in many ways, even more consequential. While the British were cracking Enigma, American cryptanalysts were doing something arguably more difficult and certainly more impactful in the Pacific theater. They broke the Japanese Purple Code, the diplomatic cipher that gave the Allies insight into Japan's strategic thinking at the highest levels. Then they broke JN-25, the Japanese naval code that allowed Admiral Nimitz to set the trap at Midway, the battle that turned the tide of the Pacific War. But the American achievement went even further. They didn't just break codes, they industrialized code breaking. The Americans developed the first programmable computer-like machines specifically for cryptanalysis, built an intelligence infrastructure that processed millions of intercepted messages, and created a system of such efficiency that they were reading Japanese communications faster than the Japanese commanders themselves in some cases. None of this diminishes what Bletchley Park accomplished, but here's the thing. When the war ended and the intelligence achievements were declassified decades later, the British story became the story. Hollywood made movies about Enigma. The public imagination was captured by the eccentric British boffins working in their country manner. The American codebreakers at Arlington Hall and the Navy's signals intelligence units became historical footnotes. Specialists' knowledge rather than common understanding. Why? Partly because the British had a better story to tell and told it more effectively. Partly because American intelligence services remained more secretive for longer. but also because there was a post-war narrative being constructed about the nature of the Allied victory, and in that narrative, Britain needed to be the brains, while America was merely the muscle. This brings us to one of the most significant and least appreciated American contributions to the war, the arsenal of democracy that literally kept Britain fighting when it stood alone. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3,000 naval vessels, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Those numbers are so astronomical they become almost meaningless, so let me put them in context. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world in size and capability, behind Romania. By 1945, America had built a military-industrial complex that outproduced the rest of the world combined, including all the Axis powers together. This wasn't just about quantity. American factories revolutionized mass production techniques, creating assembly line processes for complex weapon systems that had previously been built almost by hand. The Liberty ship program alone deserves its own epic. These cargo vessels were the workhorses of the Atlantic supply line, and American shipyards were building them at an absolutely insane pace. The record was set in 1942 when the SS Robert E. Peary was constructed in just 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. 4 days. To build an entire ocean-going cargo ship. At peak production, American shipyards were launching 3 ships every single day. The British shipbuilding industry, which had been the envy of the world for centuries, couldn't come close to this output. Then there's the Lend-Lease program, perhaps the most consequential economic policy of the entire war. Under Lend-Lease, America shipped 17.5 million tons of military equipment to the Soviet Union alone. This included 400,000 trucks that motorized the Red Army, 13,000 tanks, 15,000 aircraft, and enough food to feed the Soviet military for the entire duration of the war. Soviet marshals later admitted that without American trucks, they couldn't have maintained their offensive operations. Without American aviation fuel, their air force would have been grounded. Without American food, their soldiers would have starved. But listen to how the Soviet Union talked about their victory after the war. It was all about Russian blood and sacrifice, the heroism of the Red Army, the brilliant strategies of their generals. All true, undeniably true. The Soviets suffered catastrophic casualties and bore the brunt of the ground war against Germany. But the American contribution was airbrushed out of the story entirely. Soviet propaganda during the Cold War portrayed the USSR as having single-handedly defeated Nazi Germany, while the Western Allies cowered on the sidelines. Even today, many Russian history textbooks barely mention Lend-Lease, and when they do, it's often characterized as a minor contribution that made little difference to the eventual outcome. This erasure was strategic and political, obviously. The Cold War meant that acknowledging American help made the Soviet Union look weak. But it wasn't just the Soviets rewriting history. The British did their own version of it, just more subtly. Britain received over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to something like $600 billion in today's money. This aid kept Britain in the war during its darkest hours. The destroyers, the food shipments, the raw materials, all of it was essential to British survival. Yet the post-war British narrative emphasized their lonely stand against tyranny, the Blitz spirit, fighting on the beaches, and never surrendering. All stirring and true, but incomplete without acknowledging that American industrial might was what made that stand possible. Winston Churchill himself understood this perfectly. In private, he called Lend-Lease the most unsorted act in history, and knew Britain couldn't have survived without it. But his public rhetoric, his famous speeches and his post-war memoirs emphasized British determination and courage far more than American assistance. This wasn't dishonesty exactly, it was narrative framing. Churchill was constructing a national story of British resilience, and American aid didn't fit neatly into that heroic tale. Now let's talk about D-Day, because this is where the myth-making reaches truly impressive heights. June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. one of the most analyzed military operations ever conducted. And somehow, in the popular imagination, it's often remembered as a primarily British operation with American support. This is absolutely backwards. Of the approximately 156,000 troops that landed on D-Day, roughly 73,000 were American and 83,000 were British and Canadian. So far, pretty balanced. But here's what those numbers don't tell you. The Americans landed on 2 beaches, Omaha and Utah, which were among the most heavily defended sectors of the Atlantic Wall. The British and Canadians landed on 3 beaches with comparatively lighter defenses. The Americans also dropped 2 entire airborne divisions behind enemy lines the night before to secure the flanks, operations of extraordinary complexity and danger. The 82nd and 101st Airborne suffered massive casualties jumping into Normandy in the dark, scattered across the countryside, fighting against overwhelming odds to secure key bridges and crossroads. And the planning, the actual strategic planning of Overlord, was predominantly American. General Eisenhower was supreme commander, and while he worked with British officers, the operational concepts, the logistics, the deception plans, all had heavy American fingerprints. The Mulberry artificial harbors, often credited to British ingenuity, were actually built primarily in American shipyards. The vast majority of the naval vessels supporting the landings were American. The air superiority that made the invasion possible was achieved largely by American fighters and bombers that had been systematically destroying the Luftwaffe for the previous year. But watch any British documentary about D-Day, read the popular histories, look at how it's commemorated. There's often this subtle suggestion that Britain led the operation with American help, rather than the other way around. British commandos get extensive coverage, Montgomery's planning is emphasized, and the British contribution is foregrounded. Meanwhile, the American achievement at Omaha Beach, where troops faced withering fire and still pushed forward through sheer determination, sometimes feels like a supporting chapter rather than the central drama it was. Part of this is location bias. D-Day was launched from Britain. It was a European theater operation, and for British historians and filmmakers, it's naturally seen through a British lens. But part of it is also a deliberate effort to maintain Britain's image as a great power even as its actual power was waning. By the time of D-Day, Britain was essentially a junior partner in the alliance, but the public narrative couldn't quite acknowledge this reality. The technological innovations developed by American engineers during the war represent another area where credit has been systematically obscured. Everyone knows about British radar and German rocketry, but American technological achievements were just as revolutionary and arguably more immediately impactful. The proximity fuse, developed by American scientists, was a game-changer for anti-aircraft warfare and artillery. It allowed shells to explode near their targets without requiring a direct hit, increasing effectiveness exponentially. This single innovation made kamikaze attacks far less deadly and protected countless ships in the Pacific. Eisenhower later said the proximity fuse was one of the 3 most important technologies developed during the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Speaking of which, let's address the Manhattan Project, because even here, where American achievement is undeniable, there's been an effort to internationalize the credit. Yes, the theoretical physics that made the atomic bomb possible was developed by scientists from many countries. Einstein was German, Bohr was Danish, Fermi was Italian, and British scientists made important contributions. But the Manhattan Project itself, the actual industrial and engineering effort that turned theoretical physics into a working weapon, was overwhelmingly American. The United States spent $2 billion, employed 130,000 people, and created entire secret cities to build the bomb. The scale of the effort was unprecedented, requiring innovations in metallurgy, chemistry, engineering, and industrial processes that had never been attempted before. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford were American achievements, funded by American money, built on American soil, and led by American administrators even if the scientific team was international. Yet in some tellings of the story, you'd think the bomb was a joint Allied project rather than an American one that happened to employ refugee scientists from Europe. This isn't to diminish the contributions of the European physicists, Their brilliance was essential, but the narrative sometimes obscures just how much of the achievement was organizational and industrial, rather than purely theoretical. Then there's the Pacific Theater, which might be the most egregious example of American achievement being downplayed, though in this case it's not so much other countries stealing credit as it is the Pacific War being treated as a sideshow to the European conflict. The United States fought a two-ocean war, something no other nation in history had successfully done on such a scale. While fighting in Europe, America simultaneously conducted a massive campaign across the Pacific that involved some of the most difficult military operations ever attempted. Island hopping across thousands of miles of ocean, each island a fortress that had to be taken through amphibious assault. The distances involved were staggering. The logistics of supplying forces across such vast expanses of ocean required a level of naval sophistication that was unprecedented. The battles themselves, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were among the bloodiest and most hard-fought of the entire war. Marines assaulted beaches under murderous fire. Soldiers fought through jungles against an enemy that refused to surrender, and the Navy developed entirely new doctrines for carrier warfare and amphibious operations. American submarines waged an economic war against Japan that was devastatingly effective, sinking the majority of Japanese merchant shipping and strangling their economy. American aircraft, particularly the B-29 Superfortress, brought the war to the Japanese home islands with a strategic bombing campaign that destroyed much of Japan's industrial capacity. And all of this was happening simultaneously with the European campaign. American forces were fighting in two hemispheres at once, against two completely different enemies with completely different fighting styles, in completely different environments. Yet, when people talk about World War II, the Pacific often feels like an afterthought. The Europe First strategy, which was the right strategic choice, has somehow translated into a Europe mostly narrative in popular history. The sacrifices of American servicemen in the Pacific, the innovative tactics developed there, the sheer scale of the logistical achievement, all of it gets less attention than it deserves. And since the Pacific War was almost entirely an American show, with limited British involvement after the fall of Singapore and virtually no Soviet participation until the final week, this means a huge chunk of American achievement gets relatively little recognition. Let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed: the American Merchant Marine. These weren't combat troops. They were civilians who crewed the cargo ships that kept the supply lines open across the Atlantic and Pacific. The Merchant Marines suffered a higher casualty rate than any branch of the American military except the Marines. 1 in 26 merchant mariners died during the war, killed by U-boats, aircraft, mines, or simply lost to the sea. They were torpedoed, bombed, strafed, and sent to the bottom in freezing waters or burning oil slicks. And they kept sailing, kept delivering the supplies that made the Allied victory possible. Without the Merchant Marine, there would be no D-Day, no supplies for the Red Army, no fuel for the RAF, no food for Britain. These men made the arsenal of democracy actually function, turning American production into deliverable aid. Yet they received almost no recognition, were denied veteran status for decades after the war, and were largely written out of the heroic narrative of American participation. If your own country barely acknowledges your contribution, it's hardly surprising that international histories overlook it entirely. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe is another area where American innovation and sacrifice have been overshadowed. The RAF's nighttime area bombing of German cities gets extensive coverage, documentaries about the Lancaster bombers, and the bravery of Bomber Command. And that bravery was real. The casualty rates for British bomber crews were appalling, but the American daylight precision bombing campaign was just as important and in many ways more effective at actually degrading German war production. The USAAF developed the strategy of hitting specific industrial targets rather than area bombing cities. This required flying in daylight, unescorted deep into German territory, through flak and fighter attacks that shredded bomber formations. The losses were catastrophic. On some missions, 10% or more of the bombers didn't come home. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 26,000 dead and 28,000 wounded or captured. They kept flying these missions day after day, and gradually they achieved what they set out to do. German ball bearing production was crippled, synthetic oil refineries were destroyed, aircraft factories were demolished. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was running out of fuel and couldn't train enough pilots to replace their losses, largely because of American bombing. The development of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, was an American innovation that made these missions survivable. American pilots systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe in air combat, achieving air superiority over Europe that made D-Day possible. Yet somehow the narrative often focuses on British bombing and British sacrifice while treating the American air campaign as secondary. The numbers don't support this. By 1944, the Americans were dropping more bombs than the British and suffering comparable casualties doing it. Here's something that really doesn't get talked about enough: the role of American innovation in medical care and battlefield medicine. The United States developed blood plasma storage and transportation, which saved countless lives on both sides. American doctors pioneered new surgical techniques for treating traumatic injuries, developed better antibiotics and infection control protocols, and created a medical evacuation system that was the envy of every other military. The survival rate for wounded American soldiers was dramatically higher than for any other army in the war, not because American soldiers were tougher, but because American medicine was more advanced. Penicillin, while discovered by a British scientist, was mass-produced by American pharmaceutical companies, using fermentation techniques developed specifically for this purpose. By 1945, American factories were producing 650 billion units of penicillin per month. This wonder drug was saving lives across all the Allied armies, and it was American industrial know-how that made it available in sufficient quantities to make a difference. But Fleming gets remembered as the hero of the penicillin story, while the American engineers who figured out how to actually produce it at scale are forgotten. The post-war world order was shaped fundamentally by American power, yet even this achievement has been somewhat obscured by the narrative of collective Allied victory. The United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, all of these institutions were built on American frameworks and backed by American power. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe with American money, preventing economic collapse and communist takeover. The United States essentially underwrote the entire Western economic system for the next half-century. This wasn't altruism, obviously. American policymakers understood that a prosperous Europe was in American interests. But the scale of the commitment was unprecedented. America didn't just win the war, it built the peace. Yet European nations sometimes talk about post-war reconstruction, as if they did it themselves, with American help rather than the reality that American aid was the foundation on which everything else was built. Britain talks about its welfare state and national health service as triumphs of British social democracy, without always acknowledging that American loans and Marshall Plan aid made it financially possible. France reconstructed its economy and rebuilt its military as a great power, largely on American money and security guarantees. West Germany's economic miracle was jump-started by American investment and shielded by American troops. The Soviet Union, of course, denied American contributions entirely and claimed their own suffering entitled them to dominate Eastern Europe. The sheer scale of Soviet casualties, which was horrific and undeniable, became justification for Soviet imperialism. The fact that American aid had helped make Soviet victory possible was conveniently forgotten. When Khrushchev visited the United States in 1959, he acknowledged Lend-Lease briefly, but Soviet histories written for domestic consumption continued to ignore it. Let's talk about some specific American commanders whose achievements have been overshadowed by their more famous British counterparts. General George Marshall, for instance, was probably the most important military leader of the entire war, yet he's far less famous than Churchill or Montgomery, or even Rommel. Marshall rebuilt the American military from almost nothing, managed the two-front war, selected the commanders who would lead American forces to victory, and did it all with remarkable efficiency and minimal ego. Eisenhower called him the organizer of victory, and that's exactly right. Marshall was a strategic genius whose contributions were administrative and organizational rather than battlefield heroics, which makes for a less exciting story, but doesn't make them less crucial. General Omar Bradley commanded more troops on D-Day than Montgomery, but gets a fraction of the recognition. Bradley was a soldier's general, methodical and careful with his men's lives, who consistently achieved his objectives without the drama and publicity-seeking that characterized some of his British counterparts. His very competence and lack of showmanship worked against his historical reputation. Admiral Chester Nimitz conducted one of the most brilliant naval campaigns in history across the Pacific, yet he's nowhere near as famous as Admiral Yamamoto or even British naval commanders who achieved far less. Nimitz took a shattered Pacific fleet after Pearl Harbor and rebuilt it into an unstoppable force that destroyed the Japanese Navy and projected American power across the entire Pacific Ocean. His strategic decisions at Midway, his management of the island-hopping campaign, and his coordination of naval, air, and ground forces across millions of square miles of ocean demonstrated military genius of the highest order. General Curtis LeMay, whatever you think of his later hawkishness during the Cold War, transformed American strategic bombing into a war-winning weapon. His tactical innovations, his willingness to lead from the front flying the most dangerous missions himself, and his absolute focus on mission accomplishment made him one of the most effective commanders of the war. Yet he's often remembered more for his later political controversies than for his wartime achievements. These men, and dozens of other American commanders, matched or exceeded the achievements of their more celebrated Allied counterparts, but the narrative has often pushed them to supporting roles. Montgomery gets credit for Market Garden despite it being a disaster, while Bradley's successful crossing of the Rhine gets minimal attention. Churchill's strategic vision is celebrated despite leading Britain into several costly disasters, while Marshall's brilliant strategic planning is treated as mere administration. The cultural production of post-war narratives matters enormously in shaping collective memory, and this is where British advantages have been significant. Britain had a head start in telling the war's story. British historians were writing official histories while the war was still ongoing. British filmmakers were producing documentaries and propaganda films that would shape how the war was remembered. British memoirs from Churchill and other leaders became immediate bestsellers and defined the narrative arc of the conflict. American accounts came later and were often more prosaic, focusing on specific battles or technical achievements rather than grand narratives of national survival. American culture in the immediate post-war period was more interested in moving forward than dwelling on the war. American GIs came home, used the GI Bill to build new lives, and didn't spend much time writing memoirs. The result was that the British version of events, which naturally emphasized British contributions and British perspectives, became the default template for understanding the war. Hollywood eventually produced its own war films, but even these often adopted British-influenced narratives. Films like A Bridge Too Far focus on Montgomery's operations. The Great Escape is about British POWs with American characters in supporting roles, and even Saving Private Ryan, which is explicitly about American soldiers, opens with a British-designed operation. There are exceptions, obviously, films that celebrate American achievements, but the overall cultural narrative has been more balanced than the actual balance of contributions would suggest. The educational systems matter too. In Britain, students learn about British wartime experiences, British battles, British contributions. In America, education about World War II is often less nationalistic and more focused on the war as a global conflict, which is admirable, but means American students sometimes know more about D-Day than about Iwo Jima, more about the Battle of Britain than the Battle of Midway. The result is that even Americans sometimes don't fully appreciate the scale of American achievement in the war. Now, none of this is to say that other Allied nations didn't make crucial contributions. They absolutely did. Soviet soldiers died by the millions stopping the Wehrmacht and driving it back to Berlin. The Eastern Front was the largest and bloodiest theater of the war. and Soviet sacrifice was incomprehensible in its scale. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany when America was still neutral, endured the Blitz, and provided a base from which the liberation of Europe could be launched. Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, African, and other forces from the British Commonwealth fought with distinction in multiple theaters. French resistance fighters and Free French forces contributed to the liberation of their country. Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain, Polish codebreakers helped crack Enigma before the war even started, and Polish soldiers fought from the first day of the war to the last. The point isn't that American contributions were the only ones that mattered. The point is that American contributions were essential, often decisive, and systematically underappreciated in the collective memory of the war. The narrative that has emerged treats American participation almost as if it were optional, helpful muscle to supplement British brains and Soviet blood. This is fundamentally wrong. American industrial capacity, American innovation, American strategic planning, American logistics, American fighting forces, all of these were absolutely central to Allied victory. Without American participation, Britain would likely have been starved into submission, the Soviet Union would have collapsed, or at best fought Germany to an exhausted stalemate, and Nazi Germany might well have secured its control over Europe. The revisionism has been subtle but persistent. It shows up in which stories get told and retold, which achievements get commemorated, which leaders get celebrated. It shows up in the language used to describe the war, the emphasis on cooperation and joint effort that obscures the reality that America was doing the majority of the work in most theaters. It shows up in the reluctance to acknowledge that by 1944, the United States was the dominant partner in the Western Alliance, and Britain was increasingly dependent on American support. This matters because history shapes how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. For Americans, the systematic downplaying of American achievements in World War II contributes to a lack of appreciation for what the country accomplished during that period. The generation that fought the war understood what they had done, but their grandchildren and great-grandchildren often don't. Not fully. They know America participated. They know America was important, but they often don't grasp that American power and American sacrifice were the decisive factors in achieving victory. For the world, this distorted narrative has consequences too. It creates a misleading picture of the balance of power in the mid-20th century and obscures the extent to which the post-war order was built on American foundations. It contributes to European attitudes that sometimes fail to fully recognize what American security guarantees have meant for European prosperity and peace. It feeds into narratives of American imperialism without acknowledging that American power in the 20th century was often used in service of genuinely universal goods, like defeating fascism and preventing Soviet expansion. The technological and industrial legacy of American World War II achievement also gets overlooked. The United States emerged from the war with capabilities that would shape the rest of the century. The aerospace industry that would put men on the moon was built on wartime advances in aircraft production. The computer industry that would transform the world emerged from wartime code-breaking and calculation needs. The pharmaceutical industry that would develop countless life-saving drugs grew out of wartime medical research. The managerial techniques that would power the American economy were refined in wartime factories and logistics operations. The research universities that would dominate global academia were strengthened by wartime research contracts. All of this came from the crucible of World War II, when American society mobilized its resources on an unprecedented scale and discovered capabilities it didn't know it had. That legacy deserves to be remembered and celebrated, not obscured by false modesty or diplomatic narratives of equal partnership with nations that simply didn't contribute equally. There's also the question of sacrifice, which gets complicated when discussing relative contributions. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people, a number so large it's hard to comprehend. Poland lost a fifth of its entire population. These losses were catastrophic and shouldn't be minimized. But American losses, while smaller in absolute terms, represented an enormous national commitment. Over 400,000 Americans died in the war. Tens of thousands more were wounded, and millions served far from home in conditions of extraordinary hardship and danger. Every one of those deaths represented a young life cut short, families destroyed, futures never realized. The fact that American casualties were lower than Soviet or Polish casualties was partly due to better medical care, better logistics, better equipment, all products of American industrial and organizational superiority. It wasn't that Americans fought less hard or took fewer risks. It's that American power meant they could bring overwhelming force to bear and protect their soldiers more effectively. That's a strength, not a weakness, and it doesn't diminish the sacrifice of those who died or were wounded. The economic sacrifice also shouldn't be underestimated. The United States spent roughly $4 trillion in today's dollars on the war effort, transforming its entire economy into a war machine. Rationing, price controls, industrial conversion, women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. All of this represented a fundamental reordering of American society. The fact that America emerged from the war more prosperous rather than devastated like Europe or Asia shouldn't obscure that during the war itself, Americans sacrificed enormously. And after the war, the United States didn't pocket its winnings and go home. It spent additional billions rebuilding former enemies and propping up allies, maintaining military forces around the world, and essentially underwriting global security. That generosity, flawed and self-interested as it sometimes was, represented a continuation of American commitment that went far beyond what any other victor nation provided. The intelligence networks developed during the war became the foundation for the CIA and America's Cold War intelligence apparatus. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower would later warn about was built on wartime expansions of American industrial capacity. The special relationship between the United States and Britain, the NATO alliance, the American military presence in Europe and Asia, all of this grew out of wartime partnerships and American willingness to remain engaged rather than retreating into isolationism as it had after World War I. These long-term commitments and their costs are part of the American achievement in World War II, yet they're often treated as separate from the war itself, rather than as its direct consequence and continuation. The soldiers who stayed in Germany and Japan as occupation forces, the diplomats who built the post-war institutions, the taxpayers who funded Reconstruction, all of them were continuing the work that began when America entered the war in December 1941. There's also a gender dimension to this story that deserves attention. American women contributed to the war effort in ways that transformed American society, and their contributions have been somewhat obscured in the grand narratives of military achievement. Rosie the Riveter is an icon, but she represents millions of women who built the planes, ships, and tanks that won the war. Women served as nurses near the front lines, ferried aircraft from factories to bases, worked as code breakers and intelligence analysts, and kept the American home front functioning while men were overseas. The women's branches of the military, the WACs and WAVES and others, proved that women could perform military roles effectively, laying groundwork for future integration of women into the armed forces. American women's workforce participation during the war was higher than in any other belligerent nation, which contributed significantly to America's industrial advantage. Yet their contributions are often treated as a domestic story separate from the war effort, rather than as an integral part of how America won. Similarly, the contributions of African American servicemen have been systematically undervalued. Over 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces during World War II, fighting for a country that still practiced legal segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that black pilots could match or exceed the performance of their white counterparts. Black soldiers fought with distinction in segregated units while facing discrimination from their own military. The Double V campaign, Victory Abroad Against Fascism and Victory at Home Against Racism, represented a moral clarity about the contradictions of American society that wouldn't be fully addressed until the Civil Rights Movement. The fact that these servicemen and women fought so effectively despite facing discrimination makes their achievement even more remarkable. not less, and their service helped lay the groundwork for the eventual dismantling of segregation, as Harry Truman integrated the military in 1948, partly in recognition of Black Americans' wartime service. This dimension of American achievement, the beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution, grew directly out of the war experience and represents another way America changed itself and the world during this period. The scientific and academic mobilization deserves more attention too. American universities and research institutions contributed enormously to the war effort, developing new technologies, training officers and specialists, conducting research on everything from tropical diseases to aerodynamics. The close relationship between American universities and the military that would characterize the Cold War was forged during World War II, when academics put aside purely theoretical research to work on immediate practical problems. This mobilization of American intellectual resources was comprehensive and effective in ways that other nations couldn't match. German scientists were brilliant, but they were hampered by Nazi ideology and suspicion. British scientists were equally talented, but had far fewer resources to work with. Soviet science was constrained by Stalinist paranoia and ideological rigidity. American science, backed by enormous resources and given relatively free rein to pursue whatever approaches seemed most promising, produced breakthrough after breakthrough. The organizational culture that made this possible, pragmatic, well-funded, relatively meritocratic, was distinctively American and contributed enormously to victory. There are smaller stories too, individual achievements that add up to a larger picture of American innovation and effectiveness. The Seabees, Navy construction battalions that could build an airfield on a Pacific island faster than anyone thought possible. The Army Corps of Engineers that constructed the Alaska Highway through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth in less than a year. The merchant shipbuilders who developed welding techniques that made Liberty ships possible. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express who kept supplies flowing to advancing armies in Europe. The signalmen who developed jam-resistant radio systems. The mechanics who kept thousands of vehicles and aircraft operational in conditions ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat. Each of these represented a small but significant American advantage, and they added up. American armed forces in World War II were characterized by exceptional logistics, superior equipment, excellent training, and an organizational culture that encouraged initiative and innovation. Junior officers and NCOs were empowered to make tactical decisions in ways that more rigid hierarchies didn't permit. American forces adapted quickly to changing circumstances and learned from their mistakes. These weren't accidents. They were products of American military culture and the democratic society that produced it. The post-war accounting of who won World War II has settled into a comfortable formula. Soviet blood, British brains, American steel. It's catchy, it gives everyone credit, and it's fundamentally misleading. America provided plenty of blood, more than enough brains, and yes, overwhelming industrial capacity. The formula makes it sound like America just showed up with money and factories while others did the thinking and dying. That's not what happened. American strategic planning won the Two-Ocean War. American intelligence broke the codes that made victory possible. American industry didn't just provide steel, it revolutionized warfare through mass production of sophisticated weapon systems. American forces fought and died on every front, in every theater, against every enemy. American innovation produced the technologies that changed the war. American logistics made operations possible that had never been attempted before. American leadership built the coalitions and planned the campaigns, and American power built the post-war order that has, despite all its flaws, prevented another world war for nearly 80 years. The systematic downplaying of these achievements, whether through Soviet propaganda, British pride, diplomatic niceness, or American modesty, has created a distorted picture of the war that does a disservice to the generation that fought it. Those men and women deserve to have their achievements recognized fully and honestly, not parceled out in diplomatic formulas that prioritize alliance politics over historical truth. As we get further from the war, as the last veterans pass away and living memory fades, the importance of getting this history right becomes even more critical. The next generation will know World War II only through what they're taught and what they read. If what they learn obscures American achievement, treats American participation as merely supplemental to others' efforts, or fails to appreciate the magnitude of what America accomplished, then we'll have failed to pass on an accurate understanding of one of the most important periods in human history. World War II was won by the Allies collectively, absolutely. But within that alliance, American contributions were not just important, they were decisive. American power, American innovation, American sacrifice, and American leadership made the difference between Allied victory and something far worse. That's the truth. And it's a truth worth remembering and celebrating, not as jingoism or nationalism, but as an accurate accounting of what happened and why it mattered. The greatest generation didn't just participate in history, they shaped it, and they did so in ways that deserve to be recognized fully, honestly, and without diplomatic equivocation. The story of American achievement in World War II isn't about diminishing others' contributions, it's about ensuring that American contributions aren't diminished. That's a story worth telling, and it's a story that too often hasn't been told completely.